morning light from the artificial sun filled the classroom on Space Station Harmony 7, and 23 students sat at their desks while their teacher spoke about galactic history. Una Park was 12 years old, and she sat at the back of the room near the window where she could see the stars outside. Was a quiet girl who rarely spoke in class, but her dark eyes watched everything around her with careful attention. Professor Telex stood at the front of the classroom, his blue Valorian skin shimmering slightly as he moved his forearms to point at the holographic display. Today, we will learn about how humans joined the Galactic Council 50 years ago, he said. In his gentle voice, some of the alien students whispered to each other, and Una could hear what they said. Humans are so weak, the Draxian boy named Kel muttered to his friend. They have no claws, no telepathy, no natural armor, and their planet is so dangerous that most species cannot survive there for even one day. His friend, a tall Morvian with gray scales, laughed quietly and added, I do not understand why the council even let them join. Una did not react to their words because she had heard them many times before. Humans were newcomers to the galaxy, and many alien species looked down on them. Her grandmother had told her that this was nothing new, and that humans had always been underestimated throughout their history. Remember, little Una, her grandmother would say, when others think you are weak, that is when you have the greatest advantage. Professor Telex continued his lesson, explaining how the first human diplomats had traveled to the council headquarters and surprised everyone with their determination and creativity. Una listened carefully while also watching her classmates. There was Mira, a Florian girl with green skin and flower-like hair, who sat near the door. Myra was shy and gentle, and her species could release sleeping pollen from their bodies when they felt threatened. Kel, the Draxian, had thick orange skin that could resist extreme heat, and his people came from a volcanic world. There were students from 12 different species in the classroom, each with their own unique ability. Sienna knew all of them because she spent her time observing rather than talking. The clock on the wall showed that lunch break was only 30 minutes away, and some students were already getting restless then. Everything changed in a single moment. A loud alarm began screaming through the station, and red warning lights flashed on every wall. Professor Telex stopped speaking immediately, his forehands freezing in the air as his large eyes grew wide with fear. Everyone stay calm, he said, but his voice was shaking. The classroom door made a heavy clicking sound as it locked automatically, and the windows darkened to hide what was happening outside. What is going on? A young Deshan girl cried out, her purple tentacles trembling. Professor Telex rushed to the communication panel on the wall and pressed several buttons. But nothing happened. The communication system is down, he said. And now the fear in his voice was impossible to hide. I cannot contact security or anyone else on the station. Una stood up slowly and walked to the window. She touched a small button on the side, and a tiny section of the darkened glass became clear again. What she saw made her heart beat faster. But she did not scream like some of her classmate soldiers were moving through the corridor outside. They were tall and covered in black armor, with 4 red eyes glowing behind their helmets. Una recognized them from her history lessons. They were Krath soldiers from the Krath Dominion, one of the most hostile empires in the galaxy. The Krath had been enemies of the Galactic Council for centuries, and they were known for their cruelty and their powerful military. Professor, Una said quietly, the Krath are here. The classroom went completely silent. Every student stared at Una, and then at the window, and then at each other. Professor Telex made a sound of pure terror, and his blue skin turned pale. The Krath, he whispered. But how did they get past the station defenses? Nobody had an answer outside. The Krath soldiers were moving in organized groups, checking every door and every room. Una watched them carefully, noting how they communicated with hand signals and how they stayed in formation. They are searching for something, she said. more to herself than to anyone else or someone. A young boy started crying, and soon other students joined him. The fear in the room was so thick that Yuna could almost feel it pressing against her skin. Professor Telex tried to comfort the students, but he was just as scared as they were. His species were scholars and artists, not warriors, and he had no idea what to do. Yuna turned away from the window and looked at her classroom. She saw the desks and chairs arranged in neat rows. She saw the supply cabinet in the corner, filled with art materials and science equipment. She saw the ventilation grate near the ceiling, large enough for a child to crawl through. She saw 22 terrified classmates and one terrified teacher. And in that moment, something changed inside her. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind once again. When you cannot fight with strength, you fight with your mind. Yuna had spent her whole life watching and learning and thinking. She had memorized the layout of the station during her first week here. She knew which corridors led where and which doors could be opened manually. She understood how different species thought and what abilities they possessed. All of this knowledge suddenly felt important in a way it never had before. The Krath soldiers were getting closer. Yuna could hear their heavy footsteps in the corridor, and she knew they would reach this classroom soon. She had maybe 10 minutes, maybe less. Professor Telex, she said, and her voice was calm and clear. I need you to listen to me. The Valorian teacher looked at her with confusion. This quiet human girl who never spoke in class was suddenly standing in front of him with determination in her eyes. We cannot wait for help, Yuna continued, because help might not come in time. We need to protect ourselves. I think I know how. Professor Telex stared at her for a long moment. He saw something in her face that he had never noticed before. Behind those quiet dark eyes was a sharp mind that was already working on a plan. What do you suggest? He asked. Yuna looked at her classmates, at all these different species with all their different abilities alone. They were just scared children, but together, with the right plan, they might be something more. First, she said, I need everyone to tell me exactly what they can do. Outside, the Krath soldiers kicked open another door and found it empty. They were getting closer to the classroom where 23 children waited, but they had no idea that inside that room, a 12-year-old human girl was already preparing to fight back in ways they could never expect. The hunt was about to begin. But the Krath did not know that they were not the only hunters on this station. The students gathered around Yuna in a tight circle, their fear slowly mixing with something that felt like hope. She moved quickly through the group, asking each one about their abilities and listening carefully to every answer. Myra, the Florian girl, spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. My species can release sleeping pollen, she said, but I have never used it before, and I do not know how strong it is. That is perfect, Yuna replied with a small nod. Kel, the Draxian, stepped forward next, his orange skin glowing slightly under the classroom lights. My body can resist extreme heat, he said, and I can touch hot surfaces without getting burned. A small Dacian boy raised one of his purple tentacles and said, I can squeeze into very small spaces because my body has no bones. One by one, the students shared what they could do. Some abilities seemed useless at first, like the Morvian girl who could change the color of her scales, or the Valaxian boy who could hold his breath for 30 minutes. But Yuna listened to each one with serious attention, her mind connecting pieces like a puzzle. Every ability matters, she told them, because every ability can help us survive if we use it the right way. Professor Telex watched in amazement as this quiet human girl took control of the situation. He had taught thousands of students over his long career, but he had never seen anything quite like this. What is your plan? He asked. Yuna pointed to the door and said, the Krath will come through there soon, and they expect to find scared children who will surrender without a fight. They expect easy hostages, not enemies. We are going to show them that they made a very big mistake. She walked to the supply cabinet and opened it. Looking at everything inside, there were bottles of colored liquids for science experiments, rolls of wire for art projects, and sheets of reflective material for making decorations to most people. These were just classroom supplies to Yuna. They were weapons. Myra, she said, I need you to stand here beside the door, hidden behind this cabinet. When the first soldier comes through, you release your pollen directly into his face. Myra's green skin turned a lighter shade, which meant she was scared. But she nodded and moved to her position. Yuna took a roll of thin wire from the cabinet and stretched it across the floor about 10 steps from the door. This will trip the second soldier if he rushes in after the first one falls. She looked at Kel and pointed to a metal pipe that ran along the ceiling. Can you climb up there and wait? When I give you the signal, grab that pipe and hold it tight. Your body heat will make it too hot for anyone to touch. Kel grinned because he finally understood, and he climbed up to his position without another word. The other students watched Yuna work, and something changed in their eyes. The fear was still there, but now it was joined by determination. She was not just giving them a plan, she was giving them a reason to believe they could survive. The heavy footsteps outside grew louder, and everyone froze. 2 Krath soldiers stopped right outside the classroom door, and the children could hear them talking in their harsh language. Just younglings inside. One soldier growled, Easy prey for the Dominion. Open the door. The lock was broken with a single powerful kick, and the door flew open. The first Krath soldier stepped inside with his weapon raised, expecting to see cowering children begging for mercy instead. Myra stepped out from behind the cabinet and released a cloud of golden pollen directly into his face. The soldier made a confused sound and tried to raise his weapon, but his movements became slow and clumsy within seconds. His 4 red eyes closed and he collapsed to the floor in a deep sleep. The second soldier roared with anger and charged into the room. His heavy boots hit the wire that Yuna had placed, and he fell forward with a crash that shook the walls before he could get up. Professor Telex rushed forward and hit him over the head with a heavy science textbook. The soldier went still. Quickly, Yuna commanded, We need to tie them up before they wake. The students worked together, using more wire from the cabinet to bind the soldier's arms and legs. Yuna knelt beside one of them and removed a small device from his belt. This is a communication unit, she said, holding it up for everyone to see. Now we can hear what the other soldiers are saying. She pressed a button, and harsh Krath voices filled the room. Squad 7. Report your position. Squad 3 has secured the medical bay. No sign of the diplomat children yet. Yuna's eyes went wide as she understood what she was hearing. They are looking for us specifically, she said. Not just any hostages. The children in this classroom must be important to their plan. Professor Telex nodded grimly and replied, Many of you are the sons and daughters of diplomats and council members. The Krath must want to use you as bargaining tools. The fear returned to the students' faces. Stronger than before. Being random hostages was terrifying enough, but being the main target of an entire military operation was something else entirely. A Morvian girl started crying and said, We should just surrender, because they will find us eventually. Maybe they will not hurt us if we do not fight back. Some other students nodded in agreement, their hope fading as quickly as it had appeared. Yuna stood up and looked at each of them in turn. Her voice was quiet but firm when she spoke. The Krath do not show mercy, she said, and surrendering will not make us safe. It will only make us prisoners. But right now, we have something they do not expect. We have each other, and we have the element of surprise. She pointed to the unconscious soldiers on the floor. 2 of their best warriors came to capture us, and look what happened to them. The Krath think we are weak and helpless. That is their mistake, and we can use it against them. Kel climbed down from his position and stood beside Yuna. "She is right," he said. "And I would rather fight than give up." One by one, the other students nodded, and the determination returned to their eyes. Yuna smiled and pointed to the ventilation grate near the ceiling. "We cannot stay here because more soldiers will come when these two do not report back. But we can move through the vents to somewhere safer. The Krath are too big to follow us, and we know this station better than they do." Professor Telex helped the students climb into the ventilation system. One by one, Yuna went last, taking one final look at the classroom that had become their first battlefield. She tucked the stolen communicator into her pocket, knowing it would help them avoid enemy patrols. As she crawled into the vent behind her classmates, she could already hear more Krath soldiers approaching the classroom. They would find their unconscious comrades. In the empty room, they would realize that their easy prey had escaped, and then the real game would begin. Yuna smiled in the darkness of the ventilation. She was just a 12-year-old human girl with no claws or special powers, but she had her mind, and she had her classmates, and she had her grandmother's lessons. The Krath had started this fight. Now she would finish it. The ventilation shafts were dark and cramped, but the children moved through them in single file without making a sound. Yuna stayed at the back of the group, listening to the stolen communicator and tracking every Krath patrol on the station. Professor Telex led the way at the front, his forearms helping him move quickly through the narrow space. "Squad 7 is not responding," a Krath voice crackled through the communicator. "Send another team to investigate their last position." "Understood, Commander Vrak," another voice replied. "We are on our way to the education sector now." Yuna whispered the information forward, and the group changed direction to avoid the approaching soldiers. They crawled for what felt like hours, stopping whenever Krath patrols passed beneath them. The smaller students had the easiest time in the tight spaces, while the larger ones struggled to keep up, but nobody complained. And nobody asked to stop when they reached a junction in the ventilation system. Yuna called for a quiet rest. The students gathered in a slightly wider section where they could sit and catch their breath. "We need to keep moving," a Morvian boy whispered, "because they will search the vents eventually." Yuna nodded but held up her hand for silence. She was listening to the communicator again, and what she heard made her face grow serious. "Commander Vrak, we found Squad 7, a soldier reported. They are unconscious and bound with wire. Their weapons and communication unit are missing." There was a long pause before the commander responded. "How is this possible?" Vrak growled. "That classroom contained only children and one teacher. Unknown, Commander. But someone disabled 2 trained soldiers without firing a single shot." The commander's voice grew cold and dangerous when he spoke again. "Find these younglings immediately and bring them to me, alive. I want to know who did this, and I want them punished as an example to the entire station." Yuna turned off the communicator and looked at her classmates. "They know we escaped," she said, "and they know we fought back. Now they will hunt us with everything they have." Fear flickered in some eyes, but Kel crossed his arms and said, "Let them hunt, because we are not easy prey. What do we do now?" Mira asked softly. Yuna had been thinking about this question since they entered the vents. She had an idea, but it was risky, and she needed everyone to be brave. "We could keep running and hiding," she said, "but eventually they will find us. There are too many soldiers and too few places to hide. Our only real chance is to call for help from the Galactic Fleet." Professor Telex leaned forward and asked, "But the communication systems are down throughout the station. There is one place where we might restore them." Yuna replied, "The Central Security Hub in Section 4. If we can reach it and activate the emergency protocols, we can send a distress signal to the fleet." The students looked at each other nervously. Section 4 was on the other side of the station, and Krath patrols were everywhere. How do we get there without being caught? The Russian boy Askaduna smiled slightly and said, We do not sneak past them. We make them go where we want them to go. She explained her plan. And at first the students thought she was crazy, but as she continued talking, they began to understand. Krath expected their prey to run and hide. They expected fear and panic and mistakes. What they did not expect was counterattack from children using tools and tactics they had never seen before. Every trap we set will slow them down and confuse them. Yuna said, Every false trail will send their patrols to the wrong places. By the time they figure out what we are doing, we will be at the security hub over the next hour. The group moved through the station like ghosts. They dropped out of vents to set traps and then disappeared again before anyone could see them. Yuna used the colored liquids from the classroom to create smoke bombs that filled corridors with thick clouds. She had the Valaxian boys swim through water pipes to reach areas they could not access through vents. Myra left small amounts of her sleeping pollen at key doorways, just enough to make soldiers dizzy and slow Cal. Heated metal surfaces in narrow passages so the craft could not follow certain routes. The reflective sheets from the art supplies were placed at corners to create illusions of movement in empty corridors. Whenever Krath soldiers investigated these tricks, they found nothing but confusion. Commander Vrak, we are seeing movement in Section 7, a soldier reported. Negative, Commander. There is something in Section 2 as well. Section 9 is filled with some kind of smoke. And 3 soldiers collapsed after breathing it. What is happening on this station? Commander Vrak's voice was filled with fury when he responded. These are children playing games with us, and I will not tolerate this humiliation. All squads, spread out and search every corner. Find them now. Yuna heard this and smiled because the commander had made exactly the mistake she wanted by spreading his forces across the station. He had left fewer soldiers guarding any single area. The path to the security hub was more open than before. We go now, she whispered to the group. Quickly and quietly, they dropped from the vents into an empty corridor and ran. Professor Telex carried the smallest students who could not keep up, his forearms holding them close to his body. Kel stayed at the back to protect them from any soldiers who might appear. They passed through corridors that should have been heavily guarded, but were now empty. Yuna's distractions had worked perfectly. Every craft soldier was chasing shadows and smoke, while the real targets moved freely through the station. But she knew this advantage would not last forever. Sooner or later, the commander would realize what was happening. They needed to reach the security hub before that moment came. The group turned a corner and found themselves facing a long hallway with a heavy door at the end. That is Section 4, Professor Telex said. The security hub is just beyond that door. Yuna was about to signal everyone to move forward when she heard voices coming from behind the door. Krath voices. 2 guards, she whispered after listening carefully, standing right in front of the hub entrance. She looked at her team and made a quick decision. Myra and Kel, come with me and Professor Telex. Everyone else, wait here and hide. If something goes wrong, go back to the vents and keep moving. The other students nodded and pressed themselves against the walls where they could not be seen. Yuna took a deep breath and walked toward the door behind her. Mira prepared her pollen and Kel flexed his heat-resistant hands. Professor Telex looked terrified but did not run away. They were so close to their goal now. Just 2 more guards stood between them and the chance to save everyone. On the station, Yuna thought about her grandmother, about the stories of survival and courage. She thought about her classmates depending on her and trusting her. She thought about the Krath commander who believed that humans were weak and helpless. And then she pushed open the door and stepped into the light. It was time to show the galaxy what a human could really do. The two craft guards turned toward the door the moment it opened. Their weapons raised and ready to fire, they saw a small human girl standing in front of them. And for just 1 second, they hesitated. That hesitation was all Yuna needed. Now. She shouted. Myra stepped out from behind her and released a thick cloud of golden pollen directly at the guards. First soldier inhaled it immediately and dropped to his knees, his eyes closing as sleep overtook him. The second guard was smarter and covered his face with his armored hand. Blocking most of the pollen, he raised his weapon and pointed it at the children. Foolish younglings, he growled. You think such tricks will work twice? But he had forgotten about Calidraxian boy, rushed forward and grabbed a soldier's weapon with both hands. And his body temperature rose instantly. Metal of the weapon became so hot that the guard screamed and let go before he could react. Professor Telix swung a fire extinguisher into the side of his helmet with all 4 arms. The impact sent the guard crashing to the floor. Unconscious. We did it, Myra whispered. Her voice trembling with relief. Una did not celebrate because there was no time. She ran past the fallen guards and reached the door to the security hub. It was locked with a complex electronic system that required a special code. I cannot open this, she said. Looking at the keypad, Professor Telix moved beside her and examined the lock with his experienced eyes. Let me try, he said. I have some knowledge of station security systems from my years as a teacher. Here. His 4 hands moved quickly across the keypad, trying different combinations. The seconds felt like hours as they waited at any moment. More craft soldiers could arrive and trap them in this corridor. Hurry, Professor, Cal urged. Looking back toward the door they had come through, sweat appeared on Professor Telix's blue forehead. But he kept working. Finally, there was a soft click, and the heavy door slid open. Inside was the central security hub. A large room filled with screens and control panels. Lights blinked everywhere, and the hum of machinery filled the air. Everyone inside. Quickly, Yuna ordered. She waved for the other students hiding in the corridor to join them, and they ran into the hub one by one. The last student was barely through the door when Yuna sealed it behind them. This door is reinforced, Professor Telix said, and it will take the craft time to break through. Yuna nodded and walked to the main control panel. The screen showed images from security cameras all over the station, and what she saw made her heart sink. Craft soldiers were everywhere. They controlled the docking bays, the medical center, the residential areas, and most of the main corridors. Hundreds of station residents were being held as prisoners in large groups. There are so many of them, a young Deshan girl whispered. Yuna studied the screens carefully, looking for any weakness. In the enemy position, she found what she was looking for when she noticed that the Kroth communication center was located in Section 12. If we can disable their communications, she said, their forces will become confused and disorganized. But first, we need to send our own signal to the Galactic Fleet. Professor Telix sat down at one of the control stations and began working. The main communication array is damaged, he reported, but there is an emergency backup system that might still function. How long will it take to activate? Yuna asked. A few minutes if I am lucky. Yuna looked at the screens again and saw something that made her blood run cold. Commander Vrak himself was leading a group of elite soldiers towards Section 4 somehow. He had figured out where they were heading. We have company coming, she announced, and they will be here soon. The students moved around the hub nervously, not sure what to do. Yuna thought quickly and said, we need to slow them down while Professor Telix works on the signal. She turned to the control panel and searched through the station's emergency systems. There were fire suppression protocols, lockdown procedures, and environmental controls. All of these could be used as weapons if she was clever enough. Can you access the station's internal systems from here? She asked the professor. Yes, he replied without looking up from his work. This hub controls almost everything. Yuna smiled and began pressing buttons in the corridors leading to Section 4. Bulkhead doors suddenly slammed shut in front of the approaching craft soldiers. Emergency lights started flashing, and loud alarms filled the air. The ventilation system in one corridor began pumping out cold air at maximum power, dropping the temperature so low that the soldiers could barely move. Commander Vrak roared with anger as obstacle after obstacle appeared in his path. Someone is using the station systems against us. He shouted to his troops, "Find another way around." But every route they tried was blocked by something new. Doors closed, lights went out, and the station itself seemed to be fighting against them inside the security hub. The students watched the screens with amazement. "She is using the whole station as a weapon," Kel said with admiration in his voice. Yuna did not respond because she was too focused on staying one step ahead of the commander. For every door he cut through, she closed another. For every path he found, she blocked two more. It was like playing a game of strategy against a much stronger opponent. But even the best strategy could not hold forever. Commander Vrak was getting closer with every passing minute, and his soldiers were destroying the doors faster than Yuna could lock them. "Professor, how much longer?" she called out. "Almost there," he replied, his four hands flying across the controls. "Just a little more time." A loud crash echoed through the hub as the craft began working on the main entrance door. Heavy impacts shook the walls, and small cracks appeared in the reinforced metal. "They are breaking through," Myra cried out. Yuna looked around the room at her classmates, at all these children who had trusted her and followed her through the most terrifying day of their lives. She could not let them down now. "Everyone get behind the control stations," she ordered, "and stay down no matter what happens." She picked up a metal pipe from the floor and stood facing the door. It was not much of a weapon, but it was all she had. The door buckled inward with another massive impact. One more hit, and it would fall. Professor Telek suddenly shouted, "The signal is ready. I am activating the emergency distress beacon now." He pressed a final button, and a new sound filled the hub. It was a steady pulse that Yuna recognized from her training classes. It was the universal distress signal of the Galactic Council, broadcasting to every friendly ship within range. They had done it, but their victory celebration lasted only a moment. Door to the security hub exploded inward, and Commander Vrak stepped through the smoke. He was even more terrifying up close. Standing over 2 meters tall with black armor covered in battle scars, his 4 red eyes fixed on Yuna, and a cruel smile spread across his face. "Clever little human," he growled, his voice deep and filled with menace. "You have caused me great trouble today." He raised his weapon and pointed it directly at her chest. But game's end now. Yuna stood her ground, the metal pipe still in her hand. She was terrified, but she did not show it behind her. She could hear her classmates crying quietly, and Professor Telek trying to shield them. The signal was broadcasting, but help could be hours away. They had come so far, only to fail at the very end. Commander Vrak laughed and said, "Did you really think younglings could defeat the craft Dominion? Humans are weak and pathetic creatures who do not belong among the stars. Your little rebellion ends here." He stepped closer, his weapon humming with deadly energy, but Yuna did not move. She kept her eyes locked on his, and in her mind, she was already planning her next move. The game was not over yet. Commander Vrak stood before Yuna with absolute confidence in his victory, believed the fight was over and that these children had finally been defeated. But Yuna had not stopped thinking, not even for a single moment. "You say humans are weak," she said, her voice calm despite the fear pounding in her chest. "But do you know why humans survived on Earth?" The commander paused, surprised that this small creature would speak to him instead of begging for mercy. "Your world is irrelevant," he sneered. "A primitive rock inhabited by primitive beings." Yuna shook her head slowly and replied, "Earth is one of the most dangerous planets in the galaxy. Predators, Diseases, natural disasters, extreme temperatures, and countless other threats that would kill most species. Yet humans did not just survive. We became the dominant life form on our entire planet. Do you know how we did it? Commander Vrak laughed and said, "I do not care about your history lessons, youngling." But Yuna noticed that his weapon had lowered just slightly as he spoke. He was listening. Even if he did not want to admit it, that was exactly what she needed. While she talked, her hands moved slowly behind her back, reaching for the stolen communicator in her pocket. "We survived because we never stopped thinking." Yuna continued, "We survived because we adapt to any situation. We survived because we work together and use every tool available to us." Her fingers found the communicator and pressed a specific button without looking. It was the station's emergency override code that Professor Telix had entered. Earlier she had memorized it while watching him work, and most importantly, she said, looking directly into the commander's 4 red eyes, "We survived because we never ever give up." The moment she finished speaking, every light in the security hub went out. Complete darkness filled the room. And Commander Vrak shouted in surprise, "What trickery is this?" He roared, but Yuna was already moving. She knew the layout of the hub from studying the screens earlier, and she did not need light to find her. She dove to the left, just as the commander fired his weapon at where she had been standing. The energy blast hit the wall behind her and showered sparks across the room. "Professor Telix now!" Yuna screamed. The Valorian teacher activated the station's emergency lockdown from his position at the control panel. Heavy blast doors slammed down throughout Section 4, trapping the Krath soldiers who had followed the commander. Alarms blared at frequencies that were painful to Krath hearing, and they clutched their heads in agony. Commander Vrak stumbled backward, disoriented by the noise and the darkness. He swung his weapon wildly, trying to hit something, anything, but a shape moved in the shadows behind him. Professor Telix charged forward with all the courage he had never known. He possessed his 4 arms wrapped around the commander's weapon and pulled it aside. Just as it fired again, the blast missed the children and hit the ceiling. Instead, Yuna did not waste the opportunity. She ran forward and swung her metal pipe at the back of the commander's knee. It was a weak spot in his armor that she had noticed. When he walked through the door, the impact made him cry out and fall to one knee. Kel rushed in next, grabbing the commander's armored hand and heating it until the metal glowed red. The commander dropped his weapon and swung his free arm at the boy, but Mira was there with another cloud of sleeping pollen. And this time, there was no escape. The commander breathed in the golden particles, and his movements became slow and clumsy. He tried to stand, but his body would not obey. "Impossible," he gasped, his voice fading. Defeated by children, his 4 red eyes closed, and he collapsed to the floor with a crash that shook the entire room. For a long moment, nobody moved. The students stared at the fallen commander, unable to believe what had just happened. Then the emergency lights flickered back on, and Yuna stood over their defeated enemy with the metal pipe still in her hands. "We did it," she said quietly. "We actually did it." The cheers that followed were loud, enough to be heard throughout the station. Children who had been terrified an hour ago were now jumping and hugging each other with pure joy. Professor Telix slumped against the control panel, exhausted but smiling with all 4 of his hands raised in triumph. The distress signal continued to broadcast, and within 30 minutes, the first ships from the Galactic Fleet arrived at Space Station Harmony 7. When the fleet soldiers boarded the station, they expected to find a hostage situation. Instead, they found Krath soldiers trapped in locked sections throughout the station. They found the enemy commander unconscious and bound with wire in the security hub, and they found 23 children from 12 different species, led by a 12-year-old human girl. The rescue operation became a liberation as fleet soldiers secured the station and freed the captured residents. News of what happened spread quickly across the galaxy. A class of schoolchildren had outsmarted and defeated an entire Kroth assault force. It was the most unlikely victory in recent galactic history. A Galactic Council official arrived on the station that evening to meet with the Presidos. Heroes. Admiral Zatara was a tall Morvian with silver scales and a reputation for being stern and unemotional, but even she seemed amazed when she entered the security hub and saw the young faces looking back at her. I have read the reports, she said, but I find them difficult to believe. How did children accomplish what trained soldiers could not? The alien students all turned and pointed to Yuna. Stepped forward, still wearing her dirty school uniform and still holding the metal pipe she refused to put down. We worked together, Yuna said simply. Everyone contributed something, and every ability mattered. The Kroth expected us to be scared and helpless. We showed them they were wrong. Admiral Zatara studied the human girl for a long moment. She had heard that humans were unremarkable among the galactic species. No special abilities, no natural weapons, no extraordinary senses. Yet this child had defeated a Kroth commander through nothing but planning and determination. You did more than survive, the Admiral said. You turned an entire military operation into chaos using classroom supplies and ventilation shafts. How did you know what to do? Yuna thought about her grandmother's stories and her lessons about human survival. She thought about all the times people had called humans weak and primitive. She thought about her classmates who trusted her when they had every reason to give up. Humans have always been underestimated, she replied. On Earth, we were smaller and weaker than most predators. We had no claws or fangs or armor, but we learned to watch, to think, and to never stop trying. That is how we survived our world. And that is how we will survive anywhere in the galaxy. Admiral Zatara nodded slowly, and something like respect appeared in her eyes. I believe the Galactic Council has misjudged humanity, she said. Today, you have shown us what your species is truly capable of. She reached down and shook Yuna's hand, a gesture of honor among many galactic cultures. When you are older, young human, I would be proud to have you serve in my fleet. Yuna smiled and replied, Thank you, Admiral. But I think I want to be a teacher. Today showed me how important it is to help young people discover what they can do. The other students gathered around Yuna, and she looked at each of them with warmth in her eyes. Mira, who had overcome her shyness to use her pollen in Battlekill, who had turned his heat resistance into a weapon. Professor Telix, who had found courage he never knew he had. Every single one of them had been part of this victory. That night, as repair crews fixed the damage and families reunited across the station, Yuna stood alone by a window looking out at the stars. Grandmother been proud of her today. Humanity had proven once again that strength was not about muscles or claws or special powers. It was about heart-mind and the refusal to ever give up. The Kroth had sent an army to capture children. They had underestimated humanity, and a 12-year-old girl had made them regret that mistake. Somewhere out in the galaxy, other enemies were watching and learning. The humans were not weak. They were perhaps the most dangerous species of all, because they never stopped thinking. They never stopped adapting, and they never, ever stopped fighting for those they loved. Yuna smiled at her reflection in the window and whispered to herself, Not bad for a quiet girl who sits at the back of class. Then she turned and walked back to join her classmates. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new adventures, but tonight, they had earned their rest. The galaxy would never look at humans the same way again.